Tonight, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce our Martin Luther King Jr. speaker for this evening, Ms. Angela Davis.
Well, thank you for the wonderful welcome. I suppose I haven't been to the University of Pittsburgh in quite a while. But let me say, first of all, good evening to all of you. And I'd like to thank the Black Action Society for inviting me to speak during your celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Week. This has been a very unique MLK holiday period. Perhaps the most unique holiday we've yet experienced because it coincided with the inauguration, the second inauguration of the first African American president. I must tell you that I was in D.C. on Sunday night attending one of the inaugural balls. I attended the Peace Ball. And it was quite exciting to celebrate the inauguration with Ben Jealous, who is the director of the NAACP, Julian Bond. Some of you may know Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! You may have heard Sweet Honey in the Rock.
Yay!
And I know everybody knows Mos Def. So it was absolutely incredible celebrating the inauguration in that way. After the ball was over, about 2 in the morning, a small group of us decided to visit the King Memorial. And I will forever remember Martin Luther King Day 2013, not only because of the inauguration, but because of how it felt to confront this vast stone monument at 2 o'clock in the morning when no one else was there. You may know that the street address for the monument is 1964 Independence Avenue, 1964 for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And Dr. King, in the way the monument has been sculptured, looks over the water towards the Jefferson Memorial. There were 4 of us that evening. And we walked along the wall reading the quotes. It was kind of cold. But we couldn't resist that opportunity. Probably never again will we have the opportunity on the day we celebrate as the holiday, and also on the day Obama was inaugurated. And there are 14 quotes on the wall that stretches behind the sculpture. And one of them reads, I'm not going to quote all of them, but I want to share one of them with you. I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. And you may know that there's some controversy around the quotes that were actually etched onto the sculpture itself. One of them says, I was a drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness. And people have challenged the paraphrasing of something Dr. King said, because it sounds as if he were somewhat self-serving. I was a drum major for peace, for justice, peace, and righteousness. What he actually said was this, and I'm reading that quote: if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice, say that I was a drum major for peace, and that I was a drum major for righteousness. You may know that abbreviated quote is going to be removed from this quote. But here we are, 58 years after the Montgomery bus boycott, which was the occasion of Dr. King's emergence as a spokesperson for the Black freedom movement in Alabama. 50 years after the March on Washington, 45 years after Dr. King was assassinated, 27 years after we first began to celebrate MLK Day, and only 13 years since all of the states in this country began to observe MLK Day. Of course, the word that is most frequently associated with Dr. King is dream, or the phrase that is most frequently associated is I have a dream. And speaking of dreams, which I wonder whether anyone could have imagined 58 years ago that the second inauguration of an African American president would coincide with the observance of MLK Day. The fact that we can point to that convergence tells us that we have indeed come a very long way since Black people first began to dramatically challenge the persistence of Jim Crow racism in the South. But while we celebrate the historic occasion of Obama's second term, it is important, I believe, to reflect on the conditions that made his election possible. Because it seems to me that the most important aspect of both of the elections was not so much the rise of a Black individual to the presidency, but rather the movements and mobilizations that made it possible for him to be elected. And I should say also, as we observe MLK Day, as we pay tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we are actually paying tribute to the thousands and hundreds of thousands and even millions of people who joined the struggle for freedom. And I always like to point out that, and I'll say parenthetically that I read a description of what I was asked to speak about, and each speaker is supposed to speak out a little known fact in our history. Well, I hope I share a couple of aspects of our history that we don't generally focus on. But one is that Dr. King could not have emerged as the powerful figure, a man who eventually got the Nobel Peace Prize, a man who is celebrated in Washington, one of the, I think, 4 African Americans for whom there are monuments in Washington. Had not it been for ordinary people.
That's
It
right.
was ordinary people who waged that again, but I think it bears repeating. The people in Montgomery, Alabama, who made it possible for that successful bus boycott were poor people.
That's right.
They were poor black people. They were poor black women. They were maids and washerwomen and cooks. These were the people who refused to ride the bus. And of course, if you know the story of the Montgomery bus boycott, you know the name of Joanne Robinson. And you know her book, which is called The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. And so let us remember that we are not focusing on individuals, neither the individual Dr. Martin Luther King nor the individual Barack Obama. As disappointed as some of us may be about Obama's failure to live up the promise of his first campaign, and I don't think anyone could have lived up to the promise of that campaign. Now, the themes were hope and change, and all of us projected all of our aspirations onto this election. And some of us thought that all we had to do was elect Obama, and the revolution would arrive. But I think that it is important to pay tribute to the people who waged that campaign, the young people, the labor activists, others who absolutely refused to believe that it was impossible to elect an African American president in 2008. And especially a black president who identified with the tradition of Martin Luther King. Now, this is a special year. This is the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I find it rather bizarre that we have not had massive celebrations. There used to be something called Emancipation Day. And black people would pour out into the street, we have marches and festivals. And how is it that we have forgotten that? Well, of course, we were reminded about our connection to slavery by a couple of films that some of you may have seen over the holidays. Right? And I assume a lot of you saw Lincoln, right? Yeah? Well, actually, you should see it. It's a very interesting film. And Daniel Day-Lewis is a great actor. But there's a backstory behind Lincoln's effort to get the 13th Amendment passed. So let's talk for a moment about the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the 150th anniversary. January 1st was the 150th anniversary of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think we should be celebrating it, but critically celebrating, recognizing that actually the Emancipation Proclamation was a part of a military strategy. It was much more a military strategy than it was a measure to free human beings from an oppressive, racist, and immoral institution. Eric Foner has written a new book. And if you see the film, I would suggest that you also read the book. This is not the book on which the film is based, but read Eric Foner's book, which is entitled The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. Because there you will become acquainted with the complexity of the story of emancipation. The backstory to the story that is told by the film, which covers the last few months of Lincoln's life and his effort to get the 13th Amendment passed. Foner points out that only months before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he was still talking about the strategy of colonization. And you're familiar with colonization, right?
Yes.
Colonization within the context of Black history. The idea was that if Black people were freed, they could not remain in this country. They would have to go somewhere else. And of course, very few people knew the country from which they actually came, the actual area of their birth, because in many instances, we're not even talking about nations. But in 1862, Lincoln met with a group of Black leaders from Washington. And according to Lincoln, he seemed to blame, according to Foner rather, Lincoln seemed to blame the presence of Blacks in America for the Civil War. He said, "But for your race among us, there could not be war." But at the same time, according to Foner, he issued a powerful indictment of slavery. It was, quote, "the greatest wrong inflicted on any people." But then he added that because of racism, Black people would never achieve equality in America. And in that sense, he was probably much more prescient than most, because we're still in the 21st century attempting to address the question of equality. Now, the majority of the Black people who met with Lincoln refused to embrace his strategy. The document itself, the Emancipation Proclamation, Foner said it is perhaps the most misunderstood of the documents that have shaped American history. How many of you have actually read the Emancipation Proclamation? Okay, a few, not very many. It might be helpful to look at it. All you have to do these days is Google it. And what's interesting about the document is that even as he publicly proclaims the emancipation of slaves of African descent, most of the document deals with the exceptions with which slaves are not going to be freed. We often act as if the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. But in actuality, it was only slaves in those states in the South that had seceded from the Union. Exactly.